With the group having completed the Louis, they knew they could get started on the second helicopter, which should be enough to take them all to the ship. The group hoped to be able to make the journey during the winter, whilst the temperatures were low enough that the majority of the infected would be in a cold-induced stasis. It was already nearing the end of September, however, so with little over a month until spring came back around, they'd need to haul ass to get the second chopper finished. That morning, the group saw a drop pod land not far from the complex. It was unclear why there was such an abundance of drop pods raining down on the area, but what was clear was that the group should try their best to save the drop pod's occupant. As the most experienced in combat, Nix and Yuso set off into the streets, feeling quite confident that they knew where the drop pod had landed this time. They made their way to the landing site, just a single block from the complex. But it seems that despite their haste, they hadn't managed to get here in time. There was absolutely no traces of the pod's occupant, or even any sort of struggle. The infected had clearly gotten to them first, and dragged them into a dark room nearby to feast. Dejected by their failure, Yuso and Nix returned back to the complex. Not 4 hours later, that very same day, yet another drop pod landed in the city, this time landing perfectly in the centre of the complex's courtyard. Excited to maybe be able to help another survivor, the group rush over, only to see that the pod's occupant appears to be completely infected. No one's quite clear on how an infected came to be in a drop pod heading for the surface, but they knew they had to handle it. Yuso did the deed, coming in without hesitation to finish off poor Jean-Luc. They offer him the respect that they can afford, which is to say that they dump his corpse outside of their line of sight, off in the street. With their disappointment for the day doubled, the group knew they had to start working on the second chopper, to give them some sort of a win for the day. Annette began throwing together a list of all the vehicle parts they would need to construct the helicopter, but the crux of the matter was, they were going to need a lot of steel and a lot of components. To counteract the depression of the day, the group all got together that night to eat some dinner and enjoy some games. With the kids being older now, they were able to be greater help around the complex. Unfortunately, they were also becoming harder to keep control of, as Annette was about to find out. Whilst walking past the defences earlier in the day, Amelia had noticed that some poor, half-consumed soul had dropped a very nice-looking SMG outside the complex. Eager to get herself a fancy new weapon, Amelia waited until night fell and snuck out past the defences to liberate the SMG from the cold, dead street. She thankfully managed to complete her short excursion without encountering any issues, although she was likely to have an issue once her mum realised she was suddenly carrying around a completely new weapon. The following morning, as Yuso was out doing some maintenance on the turrets, she heard a suspicious bashing sound coming from the walls outside. Just as she was about to investigate, however, a rapid round of shotgun blasts to the south of the complex suggested that she'd be better waiting inside the defences. It seems that one of the nearby factions of survivors weren't too pleased with the group ransacking their encampments, and had decided to try and put an end to them. Yuso quickly alerted the others, and all of the adults, aside from Shukan the pacifist, made for the entrance, looking to defend the complex. The first attacker had unfortunately outranged the flame turret to the south, and caused it to ignite. There wasn't a lot to burn down there, but since Shukan wasn't helping with the combat, she was ordered to rush down there and put out the flames before they could destroy the CCTV camera. The group took up defensive positions, and as the first attacker approached, sharpshooter Annette landed a quick hit. As she had a shield built, Annette moved forward, looking to take up a closer position in a nearby doorway, which would in turn allow Nix to take up her current position and let off some shots too. With both Nix and Ghost joining in, they made quick work of the attacker. With no signs of follow-up attackers, the group decided it may have just been a lone gunman, and made their way back into the complex. Of course, it couldn't have been that attacker who was bashing on the wall earlier, as he'd been at the south of the complex. The bashing started again, only this time the attacker got bored, and made their way to the entrance instead. Not wanting to concern the whole group with it, Yuso went out to offer some supporting fire to the turret, but in the end, sharpshooter Annette struck again, joining in the fight just long enough to land a single shot, which immediately took down the attacker. Seeing that the attacker had been toting a heavy SMG, Annette fancied grabbing herself an upgrade too. Like daughter, like mother. She ran out to grab the SMG, but just as she got her hands on it, she saw a number of other attackers rounding the outside corner of the complex. Looking to get the help of the turrets, Annette pulled back into the complex. However, the first attacker of this new wave ripped right through the group's first turrets with his chain shotgun, putting the fear in Annette. Yuso, Nyx and Maisie made their way over to help out, but Nyx quickly takes a hit. With a number of the attackers wielding chain shotguns, any hit is a massive risk. Nyx pulls back to get away from the fighting, while a massive explosion rings out behind her. It turns out that one of the attackers had an explosive belt rigged to blow upon their death. It caused a large section of the workshop's outer walls to crumble, but thankfully mostly did damage to their own teammate. Unfortunately, the last remaining turret in the complex also decided to explode upon death, setting Annette alight. In the scrum, Maisie and Yuso had also taken a number of hits, and things were starting to look dicey. Ghost and even the kids got drafted into the fight to help out. Annette was being consumed by flames and hit the ground. Maisie, bleeding out herself, decided to play the hero and rush over to Annette to put out the fire and try drag her back to safety. Connor and Amelia had taken up a position in the battery room, where a damaged section of the wall allowed them to try and weave bullets out through the gap to hit an attacker. While Ghost ran to the workshop to tend to Yuso's wounds, the attackers outside proved that their aim was a lot better than that of the children, as they managed to thread a shotgun round through the wall and directly into Connor's shoulder, ripping his arm clean off. Jubilee manages to scare off the attacker, whilst Nyx tends to herself, and Maisie finishes off her hero arc by getting both herself and Annette back to safety. With that, Jubilee grabs her newly one-armed brother and begins dragging him back towards a safer section of the compound. Being unable to fight or administer medical care, Shakan was feeling a bit useless, but seeing some components on fire, she decided that she could put them out to save the resources and prove herself useful to the group. Naturally, running straight over to the defences when there was still an attacker there, actually saw her riddled with buckshot in moments, rendering her immobile. And worst of all, she didn't even manage to extinguish the components. Recently patched up Yuso and Ghost exited the workshop, with Yuso charging to grab the downed Shakan and taking a few extra hits in the process. As thanks for her help, Ghost also got quickly downed, leaving only young Amelia to hold the fort. The attacker had broken a gap into the workshop, so Amelia opened the door and stood guard, waiting for the attacker to show their face and hoping she could take them out before they got her. But the attack never came. Yuso came back to return the favour by saving Ghost this time, and still Amelia stood guard. Everyone was in a pretty bad way, but Maisie was tending to Connor whilst Nyx tended to herself. People were prioritised based on the blood they were losing. After tending to herself, Nyx moved on to tend to Shakan, and after she'd stabilised Connor, Maisie started tending to herself. Amelia was still standing guard at the workshop, but it seemed the attacker wasn't in there and wasn't coming back. They had sustained a fair amount of damage during the fight, and it's likely that at this point, blood loss had simply overcome them. With that realisation, Amelia put down her weapon and went off to rest. With Shakan stabilised, Nyx moved on to tending Ghost. Things had looked bad, but with some good prioritisation of treatment, it looked like everyone should pull through. Although Ghost was given the extra special gift of an infection in her leg, just as a little treat. Assuming she survived her injuries, they could worry about the infection afterwards though. Maisie and Nyx worked into the small hours, tending Annette and Yuso respectively. Just as they were about to collapse from exhaustion, another sound came from the entrance, but this time it sounded a lot friendlier. A sword named Cracksman, seemingly uninfected, was asking for refuge. hoping to make up for the 2 they'd lost from the drop pods, and also quite happy at the prospect of having someone to pick up the slack around the complex whilst everyone else was tending to their gunshot wounds. Nix and Maisie were only too happy to agree, before immediately retiring to their beds for the night. Despite taking multiple beatings during the fight, Yuso was the first one back up and at him the next day. She immediately made plans to start patching up the holes in the outer walls. The last thing they needed was a flood of infected finding their way into the complex whilst half the group was bedbound. As well as planning to rebuild the old turrets, Yuso also planned to put some turrets further out into the street. Having the attackers use the corners of the complex itself as cover had annoyed her, so she wanted their turrets to be able to riddle anyone who even entered the street. They also decided not to rebuild the flame turrets. They wanted to conserve their chem fuel for the cross-planet flight, and saving their eardrums from the immolated infected wouldn't hurt either. That afternoon, a check on Ghost revealed that she'd been faring quite well against her infection, although she'd likely be stuck in bed for the foreseeable future. With Amelia and Jubilee being some of the lucky few to get out of the situation unscathed, although they had thrown themselves into the thick of it, they wanted to help out more, so Shakan set them to cleaning up the entire complex, trying to wash away the pain of the night before. Following some pretty poor quality treatment from someone who shall remain nameless, Ghost's infection got a lot closer to being a disaster than it had seemed, but thankfully in the end she was able to beat it back. Having made it a priority, Nix and Yuso were able to finish up the wall repairs the next morning, making the complex secure once more. With so many dead littering the entrance, Nix and Yuso spend some time that afternoon shuffling them out of sight of the defences, just so that anyone looking out into the street didn't need to be greeted by the sight of a mountain of decaying corpses. With the quest for the second chopper completely expending the group's component supply, the expedition team were soon back out of the city on yet another mission, this time heading to an old biotech research lab, which they hoped would be overflowing with components for them to get their hands on. After a tactical nap in the vehicles just outside the biotech lab, the expedition team rise bright and early the next morning to begin their scavenging. Unable to get the chonky tugboat close, Ghost parks up a distance from the lab and follows the scavenger on foot. Deciding that if there are any defences they would likely be in the entrance hall, the expeditioners decide instead to simply tear down a wall in the side of a random room and make their way into the lab. They begin pulling apart some of the equipment to see what they can get, but they are soon interrupted by the sound of people talking nearby. Concerned by the approaching voices, Nix and Yuso jump back in the scavenger and head towards them. Sure enough, as soon as the owners of the voices spot the scavenger, they begin lobbing what appear to be exploding toxic mushrooms towards the vehicle. In return, Yuso lobs lead rounds at them from the turret. The scavenger doesn't have any air filtration systems, so Nix has to work hard to keep the vehicle ahead of the constant stream of noxious gases being thrown their way. Thankfully, the attackers seem to be doing little actual damage to the scavenger, so after leading them on quite the chase, Yuso is finally able to bring down the last of them. Realising that their position is now known, the expeditioners decide to quickly clear the building, hoping they might find a massive stockpile of useful materials they can load up on and be on their way. Sadly, after a thorough search, no such stockpile makes itself known, so they're forced to begin dismantling things to see what they can recover. Sadly, it seems as though the lab had a lot less to offer than the group had hoped. After a full day of dismantling, only broken up by the advances of an aggressive fox, they packed up a measly 10 components and 500 steel from their excursion. There were a number of steel slag chunks in the area, and given they had plenty of space left over in the vehicles, they decided to take a bunch of them back to the complex too. They'd require a fair bit of processing, but they should at least add to the steel stockpile. They arrived home the next evening. With Annette busy creating some warmer clothing for the kids, she left the welcoming committee job to Maisie this time. Seeing their poor haul of components, Maisie suggested that it was time that they start making some themselves. It was a time-consuming and tedious task, which required a little bit of steel, but in the interest of getting out of here before spring, the group agreed it was a good idea, and decided to start fabricating their own components. Some progress had been made on completing the second helicopter, but there was still a long way to go. Crafting the components was not a quick process, and was only likely to take longer if they were resorting to fabricating their own components. The next morning though, the workshop was a veritable hub of activity, with Yuso building the vehicle parts, Annette crafting the components, and Maisie stirring big piles of shit until it turned into chem fuel. The helicopter may still be a bit off, but the excitement of getting out of their predicament was giving a lot of life to the group, and they started the next day full of energy. There was a chance, of course, that the crashed ship was useless to them, but they'd all quietly agreed not to give that thought any space in their brains, and continue onwards as though this was the solution they needed. Cracksman was making herself useful too. Eager to earn her way onto the ship, she'd spent the last few days processing the steel slag chunks that the expedition group had brought back, ensuring their steel stockpile stayed full. Running the smelter so much had caused the complex's batteries to drain quite considerably, but they figured that as long as they remembered to turn it off at night, they should be fine. And, the moment that that thought was put out into the world, an eclipse rolled around, wiping out the vast majority of their power generation. Looked like their progress might be slowed down even further. Even as the group dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, the wind turbine would be able to produce enough power to keep the workshop running, they were also hit with a solar flare, putting a swift end to any hopes of progress. It looks like it was going to be a long, dark afternoon. Blessedly, both the eclipse and solar flare had ended by the following morning, and work could continue once more. Things continued like this for a few days, with the workshop working flat out to get as much work done as possible. In amongst the stress and hard work, Shakan and Annette were still finding a lot of joy in each other's company, which was helping to lighten the moods of the rest of the group too. Nyx couldn't help but feel they weren't going to make their end of winter deadline, and began eyeing up the possibility of another expedition. There was a steel mining worksite not too far from them, and although they had a healthy supply of steel, there was a good chance that advanced tech was utilised in the mine. Advanced tech that they could break down into components. The next day, Nyx convinced the rest of the group that it was worth the effort to venture out to the mining site, and so the expedition crew hopped into their vehicles once more. This time, Cracksman also joined Ghost in the tugboat. They figured that the more people they had to break down the equipment they find, the less time it would take them to return with their spoils. Arriving at the site early the next morning, after a cold night spent sleeping in their vehicles, the expeditioners slowly moved their vehicles closer. Spotting an exposed battery and solar panel, Ghost hopped out of the tugboat and riddled the battery with bullet holes until it was destroyed. Her hope was that this would sever the power to the site, and depower any turrets that might be waiting for them. The scavenger led the way further into the settlement, with Ghost and Cracksman bringing up the rear on foot. It wasn't long before the residents began flooding out to confront the expeditioners, but as so many before them, they were met with a turret fire from the scavenger. One of the residents managed to get close enough to Ghost to take a few swings at her with an axe. But with the backup from Cracksman and the scavenger, they went down before they could do too much damage. It didn't take long after that to clear out the remaining residents. And with that job done, Nyx and Yuso hopped out of the scavenger and the whole team began exploring. One of the first things they found was another room with some aggressive boars in it. Just who was training all of these defense boars for these settlements? The one upside to how many they'd encountered was that the expedition were quite adept at dealing with the beasts now. Continuing to explore, they soon find the all-important sleeping room. Claiming their beds for the night, they continue exploring. Next up, finding a large steel room packed with potatoes, herbal medicine, and a Mega Wolverine? Thankfully the Mega Wolverine seems less aggressive than the boar. Perhaps it had already filled up on the potatoes. In the interest of returning home with all of their limbs intact, the expedition decides to leave the Wolverine alone and continue exploring. They soon find another battery and solar panel, which should give them a nice bit of extra steel and components. With the area secured, they begin making plans for what to dismantle and get to work. Late that night, back at the complex, a group of traders arrive, and since they've invited themselves into the safety of the complex, Maisie decides to browse their wares. She quickly notices that they have a bionic arm for sale, and given that poor Connor just had one of his arms ripped off by a shotgun blast, she's determined to purchase it for him. It's a tough negotiation, but Maisie's eventually able to secure the arm, in exchange for a couple of their yak, a hefty quantity of their gold, and some of their plasteel. As both the most experienced medic and Connor's mum, Annette takes it upon herself to try and attach the bionic arm the next morning. It was a pretty advanced process, but thankfully the arm came with attachment instructions included. So, with a little patience, she was able to successfully gift Connor his new and improved arm. Meanwhile, the expeditioners had spent the morning rounding up the last of their salvage and began loading onto the vehicles. They'd managed to gather a respectable 18 components, 1300 steel, a massive stack of potatoes and herbal medicine, and even a machining cabinet to help speed up the work on their vehicle components. While Annette busied herself teaching Amelia in the workshop, the expedition returned with their haul, so she ventured to the wall to let them in. The next day, the workshop crew were back at it, working hard throughout the whole day to try and get the helicopter finished. Unfortunately, they were already behind schedule, with April May rolling around once more, and bringing spring with it. The temperatures would soon rise, and the infected would begin to stir once more. The following day passed relatively uneventfully, until the early hours of the next morning. Following the sounds of distressed braying, the group found one of their yak dead, another severely injured, and a dead infected lying in the centre of the courtyard. Yuso ventured out, shotgun in hand, to investigate. There was no clear sign of how the infected had gained access to the complex, which was actually more concerning than if she'd found a massive hole in the wall. With no further information on what was going on, Yuso decided to patch up the yak and just ask everyone to be on high alert for a bit. There was no telling how the infected got in, or if another one was able to follow its path. With the kids growing older, their personalities were beginning to shine through even more. Amelia was becoming a very kind individual. Heavily influenced by her mother and Nyx, she was becoming quite passionate about both crafting and construction. Connor was continuing his love for academia, proving himself to be a very diligent student. Although his interest lay primarily in studying how to build things, interact with people, and, more recently, perhaps due to his injury, an interest in gunmanship. Jubilee was still just a happy ball of positive energy, dashing around the complex chatting to people, and always looking for new ways to add a little artistry into everyone's lives. A few days passed with work slowly continuing on the new helicopter. With their steel stockpiles, they should have plenty to make all of the components for the helicopter. It was just a matter of time. With little else to do around the complex, aside from Yuso who was helping with the crafting, the expedition team decided to head out once more. There was a hunting site nearby, and although the group had already stockpiled a decent amount of pemmican, they had no idea what their journey held in store for them, so they certainly couldn't have too much food. They did hope they might find some additional components at the camp too, to speed up the build. But even if they only got some food, it would still be a victory. Just as the expedition team left the city, the turrets at the entrance of the complex came alive, ripping through a wandering infected, confirming their fears that the infected were becoming active once more. Arriving at the hunting camp that night, the expeditioners wasted no time in engaging the residents in combat. even accidentally confusing a nearby Arctic fox, which, when hit by the scavenger, decided that it was actually the fault of the camp's residents and began hunting them instead. It didn't take long for the scavenger to completely dismantle the residents. Ghost and Cracksman hopped out of the tugboat to help, but they needn't have bothered. Yuso was more dangerous than ever with the turret. While Nix and Cracksman began repairing the minor damage that had been done to the scavenger, Yuso began searching the area, eventually finding the beds of the people they'd murdered so that they could settle in and have a nice relaxing sleep. Looking around the next morning, there didn't seem to be a lot of value in the camp. Thinking that they might settle for just a pemmican and a handful of components, Yuso then spotted something that was so surprising she didn't understand how she'd overlooked it. Some of the walls of one of the rooms was made entirely of thick plasteel plating. They might not have an immediate use for the plasteel in the construction project, but it could be used to trade and barter and was worth a pretty penny. Assigning the expeditioners to dismantling the plasteel, Yuso also spotted a small crevice in some nearby rocks that she wanted to explore further. Next tore down some of the stones and revealed a plasteel auto door hidden in the hill. Tearing it apart to obtain both the plasteel and the components, she was shocked to find yet another plasteel door behind that. There was a slight fear that this was some sort of airlock for a dangerous facility. They found that whatever had been here seemed to have suffered from a cave-in a long time ago. Happy with the extra resources from the doors, they decided to call it a day, and packed up all the pemmican and plasteel and headed home. Arriving back in the early morning, the scavenger's turret was put to action once more, with a bunch of aggressive infected roaming the streets outside the complex. Yuso was more than capable of taking them down, but it was a concerning sight to see the infected being so active. The next morning, everyone was up bright and early, and Nix was on a mission. The group had finally finished gathering together all the parts they'd need for the helicopter. And, with the infected milling around outside, Nix was determined to get them out of here, and worked through the day to assemble the second helicopter. And, that afternoon, Louis was joined in the fleet by Gustav, and the group had their ticket to freedom. Or at least they really hoped so. With that, there was nothing holding them back from travelling over to the ship now. Not wanting to leave the yak to starve in the complex when winter rolled around again, but also not wanting to release them into the city just to be ripped apart by the infected, the group instead decided to kill off the entire herd. At least that way they could make sure it was done humanely. Plus, they could use the meat to create more pemmican for their journey. Both helicopters had full tanks of gas, but it was unclear how far that would carry them, and with the future so uncertain, the group elected to fill the cargo of each chopper with half of their remaining gas. That way they could stop and refill them if needed, or, in the worst case scenario, ensure that they could get back to the complex if the ship proved to be too damaged to recommission. Splitting it between the two helicopters would make sure that, even if something went catastrophically wrong with one of the helicopters mid-flight, the other would still have the resources available to continue on. The next morning, it felt as though the infected in the city could sense the group's imminent departure, as they came spilling out of the streets near the entrance, seemingly trying one last desperate charge to get their teeth stuck into the survivors. Nix and Annette joined the turrets at the entrance to mow down the swarm of infected, proving that numbers count for little in the face of basic human ingenuity. Putting down so many infected helped quell the rest of the swarm, as, now that there were fresh corpses, those that were still left standing didn't need to go hungry. With so much chem fuel to load up, the simple act of walking from the chem fuel storage room through the workshop was adding a lot of time to their task. So much so that Yuso, in a fit of frustration, decided to simply tear down one of the walls of the chem fuel storage room, in order to give them a quicker path into loading the helicopters. By the end of the second day, they'd finally finished loading up the chem fuel and moved on to loading up the pemmican, along with any packaged survival meals they had. As the current stream of turret fire indicated, spring was well in swing at this point, which got Annette and Ghost excited about the prospect of growing their outside crops once again. Until Nix pointed out that they planned to leave in a day or two, which put a bit of a dampener on their moods. 2 whole days later, they'd almost managed to transfer all of their food to the helicopters, which is exactly when a number of the group managed to contract malaria. It seemed that, despite their best efforts, this world was determined to keep the group from leaving. With 5 of the adults falling sick, work would slow to a halt until they'd all recovered. Annette was unfortunately one of the unlucky ones who were afflicted, which meant she would need to try and tend to the others in between getting enough rest to ensure she also recovered. They had an okay stash of industrial medicine, and plenty of herbal medicine if it came to that, so Annette was somewhat confident that they could get through this without any casualties. Things slowed down a lot those days, although Yuso, Ghost and the kids tried their best to keep moving forward with the plans. With one of the helicopters fully loaded with food, Yuso began planning what else to take. They didn't want to take too much, but she figured that taking their gold, silver and jade might help if they find themselves needing to barter at some point along the way. Given their current woes, she also decided it was definitely a good idea to take some of their herbal medicine too, in case some other new illness besieges them along the way. The initial treatment of the sick seems to have gone okay. Maisie, Nick, Shakan and Cracksman were all very barely beating their infections, whilst Annette was lagging behind them a little. It turns out that it's quite hard to tend to yourself when you're already ill. Thankfully, she seemed to have learned from her first attempt, and did a much better job the next time around. Of course, she was still struggling to find some time to rest and recover, since she was also needed to tend to the others as well. Annette's rounds the next day showed that most of the group were beating their illness, if only by a little. Shakan, however, was recovering at quite a rate, and would likely be back on her feet soon. In fact, by the end of the very next day, Shakan seemed to be on the mend, while all of the others were slowly getting there too. By the next day, the group were mostly back on their feet, and ready to continue their preparations. The last step of which was to uninstall the turrets around the complex. They didn't know what awaited them at the crash site, but even if the ship was repairable, it would likely take a bit of work, and they'd need the turrets to help keep them protected while they repair it. They'd also loaded Gustav with enough components and steel to build a solar panel and a battery, in order to power the turrets if needed. On the 1st of August, the group had finally finished packing the helicopters, and they all got ready to say a big farewell to the complex, hopefully forever. The group split into 2 parties, one for each helicopter. Annette, Shakan and the kids would take Gustav, while Nix, Maisie, Yuso, Ghost and Cracksman all hopped in Louis. And with the route planned in, they rose into the air, bidding farewell to the complex and all it had done for them. They also shared a special, heartfelt farewell to the scavenger and the tugboat, which had done so much for them. Now, it was time to discover their future. Landing at the site, the group were encouraged to find a large, mostly intact ship. It had clearly taken a bit of damage, but they were hopeful it could be repaired. Annette, Maisie, Nix and Yuso all approached the airlock, leaving the others over by the helicopters to look after the children whilst they tried to gain access to the ship. Patrick explains that the Lachesis is a medical transport, travelling to the far reaches to collect obscenely rich individuals with complex medical conditions, load them into stasis tubes, and transport them to Glitterworld cities to receive top-of-the-line care. He also explains that he isn't sure what brought the ship down. As the ship's tech, he was the only one on board as it was being sent out to pick up new patients. His stasis pod woke him up after the ship had crashed. He explains that the hull foam distribution system automatically kicked in, and was able to patch up the worst of the damage to the hull. The comms console had been destroyed though, so he was unable to contact anyone to request assistance. His main issue, however, was the primary engine, which had been obliterated on impact. Without it, they couldn't get airborne. He knew about maintaining a ship, but building one had proven more difficult, and he'd spent the last couple of years trying to figure out how to rebuild it, in between fighting off infected, trying to source enough food to survive, and trying to keep the power on. He was getting close, but progress had been slow. Annette, Maisie and Nix all worked together with Patrick to finish up his plans for the engine. In order to rebuild it, they began pulling apart both Louis and Gustav in order to repurpose their parts. In the meantime, Yuso, Ghost and Cracksman handled the defences, keeping the area clear so that the others could work unharassed. The ship did have some minor hydroponics, designed only to feed a single tech whilst they carried out maintenance during flights. Thankfully, the pemmican the group had brought kept everyone going without them having to worry about food. After around 2 weeks, the group were finally able to put the final touches on the engine. After running some diagnostics, Patrick was confident the ship was functional. With a potentially very long trip ahead of them, Patrick entered a flight plan in the ship's computer, and, along with the rest of the group, he hopped back into his stasis pod, while the ship's engines roared to life, finally taking the team away from this hellish planet. Hey guys, Tuna here. Thank you so much for watching the video, especially those of you that have been following the series from the start. Please do let me know what you think of the finale down in the comments below. Personally, I was kind of disappointed that throughout the whole series none of our colonists ever got infected. It would have sucked, but it would have been a fun bit for the story. I guess I'm just getting too good at the game. Clearly I need to play a lot worse to help keep things exciting. I will have a new series starting for you real soon, so do subscribe to get notified when it drops. And until then, I shall cross my fingers that life treats you all well. Until next time, look after yourselves, and never forget, you always deserve a little treat. Bye bye!